Welcome. I'm glad you've joined me today to learn more about the science and engineering practice developing and using models. I'm Patty Works, a regional teacher partner with PIMSR, the Partnership Institute for Mathematics and Science Education Reform. This video is part of a series of modules that focus on the science and engineering practices. There are 2 videos on modeling in our series. This video is meant as an introduction to developing and using scientific models. The second video will dig more deeply into modeling in middle and high school storylines and focus more heavily on mathematical and computer-based modeling. Video 2 on modeling is not intended for elementary teachers. This video workshop can be something that you do individually or with a grade level group or PLC. You're going to want to have access to the following materials as we get ready to get started today. The readings that you'll need are linked in the description box below, and you'll also want to have a note taker, either an electronic document or paper and pen. Here are our objectives for this video workshop. During this session, we'll use a variety of resources to help you develop an understanding of what's meant by a scientific model, develop a deeper understanding of the science and engineering practice developing and using models, explore what is meant by developing and using models for each grade band, and will help you increase your knowledge of instructional strategies that can help students develop skill in developing and using models. Our focus questions will be: what is a scientific model, and what do we mean by developing and using models? During this section, we'll develop an understanding of what a scientific model is and what it is not. And we'll explore what does a lesson look like when students are engaging with developing and using models at sophisticated levels. We'll think about how does the student use of this practice increase in complexity throughout the grade bands. And last, we'll explore some instructional strategies that students can use to help develop an understanding of how to develop and use scientific models. The Kentucky Academic Standards for Science call for phenomenon-based or problem-based teaching and learning, where students are actively figuring out about phenomena or trying to solve a problem. By scientific phenomenon, we mean an observable event that occurs in the universe that we can use science ideas to explain or predict. For example, students might be working to figure out why a mudslide occurred in a specific part of a hillside, or why we see different constellations at different times of the year at our latitude, or why a particular tree has quit reproducing in one area. So how do students go about figuring out phenomena? Our standards are 3-dimensional, representing the 3 parts of the sense-making process. The science and engineering practices are what students do as they investigate, collect data, make sense of it, and create models or explanations. The cross-cutting concepts are the thinking lenses that they'll use during the sense-making process. And the content is what students know and understand as a result of this active learning. I'll give you just a moment to read this quote. Our standards call for some pretty big instructional shifts. Science instruction isn't giving students laws, theories, terminology, and facts to merely memorize and recall. Instead, we want them to learn to work like scientists and engineers do. We want students to understand how the SEPs and cross-cutting concepts are crucial to the work of scientists and engineers as they develop conceptual understandings. As we continue to improve our own science teaching practice, improving the student use of the science and engineering practices is key to student success. This is something we want to see happening in every lesson. So please take a moment to read this quote. As noted by the National Research Council, it takes time and specific attention to fully develop student use of the practices. The focus of this video is one of those practices. We'll carefully look at the practice of developing and using scientific models and learn more about how to help students develop their abilities to use this practice. The 8 science and engineering practices are what students do as they make sense of phenomenon. However, they aren't completely separate entities. I'm sure you would find that it's hard to use just one practice in a lesson. As an example, in a given lesson, students might be presented with an engaging phenomenon and make an initial model that represents their ideas. Next, they may ask questions about it. And as they're investigating those questions and planning and carrying out experiments, they'll collect data that they need to analyze and interpret. That may lead them to revising their model or to more investigations and revisions of that model. All the while, they're often obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information along the way. Real science is not a linear process, but rather a very interconnected web. So, what is a scientific model? Let's shore up our thoughts and come to a common understanding of what a model is and what a model is not. Look at the pictures here and think to yourself, are these scientific models? Let's get our initial ideas down in a T-chart. At this point, you may want to pause the video and using your note taker, create a T-chart like this one. What do you think is a scientific model? What are some definite characteristics? And what is not a scientific model? This is just an opportunity to catch your thoughts at this time. We'll be returning to this as we learn more during this session. So restart the video after you've had an idea to get your ideas down. Well, let's read some more now about what some experts in the field think about scientific modeling. There are 2 resources you are going to want to locate in the listing below this video. The first is STEM Teaching Tool number 8 on modeling. And the second is Chapter 6 on modeling from the book, Helping Students Make Sense of the World Using Next Generation Science and Engineering Practices. Chapter 6 is the released sample chapter from this book, which is an excellent resource published by NSTA Press. The entire chapter is well worth reading as you're learning more about modeling, but page 116 in the book will detail some ideas about what is not a model, and pages 117 through 118 focus on describing what is modeling. So pause the video now, take a look at that STEM teaching tool, and look at pages 116 through 118 in the book excerpt to help you add to and evaluate your own ideas on scientific models. After you finish reading individually, if you're working with a PLC or a grade level group, please take some time to stop and compare your T-charts and revise or add to your ideas before restarting the video to discuss your key takeaways. First, I'm going to start by discussing what is not a model. As I go through this list, take a moment to think of models that you may have experienced in your own science education and think about whether or not they seem to be scientific models. A scientific model is not just an art project that represents a 2-dimensional drawing in 3 dimensions. I'm picturing the labeled solar system models that we used to make in classrooms in the past a lot, simply repeating and making the model to match what the teacher shared to be correct. And a scientific model is not a representation of something that only labels parts of a system, doesn't look at relationships between those parts, and doesn't have explanatory power. So what do you think of here? Well, I can visualize the parts of a flower model that we had in botany class. And a scientific model is not a computer simulation that's only used to collect data. Students need to be looking at why or how patterns in data collected exist, and they need to be using that data to explain or predict. If we aren't thinking about relationships and patterns within the components and about how or why that's significant, we aren't really using that simulation as a scientific model. The STEM teaching tool in Chapter 6 shared many common ideas. Here you see my list. Take a minute to read through the list and compare it to your own. I've highlighted in bold here a few things that I saw as repeated points in the reading. A scientific model is a representation of an idea or phenomena. A scientific model is a result of an iterative process that supports learning, and it really makes student learning visible. Models have limitations and flaws because they aren't the real thing, and models can help us develop deeper knowledge and communicate that knowledge. Models are explanatory and predictive. We saw that several times in the readings. A model can be developed, tested, refined, and then sometimes even left behind as a new idea takes the learner in a different direction. Models are a vital part of scientific practice as the development of new ideas emerge based on evidence. And a model should show the relationships between components within a system, enabling the model to have predictive or explanatory power. And as I read, I also start a couple of ideas about what a model is that have big implications for instruction. A model is something that students really need practice in developing, revising, improving, and reflecting upon. And as they use models to help them reason, they need to think not only with the model, but about the model. Why and how are the components that they selected important to understanding that concept or process? Now that we've worked on developing our understanding of what a scientific model is and is not, and a little more about what the practice is about, let's take a look at a lesson sequence where students are engaging in scientific modeling at sophisticated levels. In an effort to help teachers recognize how overlapping the practices are and how they work synergistically in classrooms, McNeil, Singer, and Pelletier developed a grouping of the science practices that can illustrate the nature of science, shown in this diagram. We should note here that there are other groups and organizations that have grouped the practices in different ways or showed how they interact in different models. This is just one example. In this model, they group the 8 practices into investigating practices, sense-making practices, and critiquing practices. The investigating practices focus on asking questions and conducting investigations about the natural world. The product of those investigations is data. The sense-making practices analyze the data, looking for patterns and relationships in order to help develop explanations and models. A key element of science, which is often left out of K2 instruction, is critique. The critiquing practices focus on evaluating and arguing about the different explanations and models in order to develop a stronger understanding of the natural world. The table here illustrates one way to group the 8 science practices into the investigating practices, sense-making practices, and critiquing practices. So as students investigate, they ask questions, plan and carry out investigations, and use mathematical and computational thinking. As they make sense of data, they'll use the sense-making practices of developing and using models, analyzing and interpreting data, and constructing explanations. And then once those investigations have given them data and they've made sense of it, the critiquing practices of engaging in argument from evidence and obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information will come into play. As they critique their ideas, that may lead them back to collect more data, revise their models, or it may lead them to new questions to investigate. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the sense-making practice of developing and using models. McNeil and colleagues developed a website, sciencepracticesleadership.com, which is full of a multitude of resources for teachers and administrators as they develop ability to help students use the practices. There are lesson examples, scripted lessons with annotations about why the teacher is doing what they're doing with those intentional use of the practices. And there are video examples of lessons with annotations made about the practices as well. After Kate McNeil and her colleagues grouped the science practices in the diagram that we reviewed earlier, they started looking at how each practice could be broken down into levels of sophistication as a way to guide and evaluate student and teacher use of the practice on a continuum of complexity. This continuum shows 4 levels, with level 1 meaning that the practice is not observed or in use even at its most basic level, generally in a lesson, and level 4 showing sophisticated use of the practice. While Appendix F provides significantly more detail for each element of the practice at particular grade bands, this continuum shows how students can engage in the use of the practice in developmentally appropriate ways at any of these levels. Here you see their definition of developing and using models from the perspective of the science practices. Take a few minutes to read through this definition on the left, the bullet points in the center that show what students do, and a sample performance expectation and classroom example from the NGSS. Here's what stood out to me. The ILSP definition of the model is that a model is an abstract representation, not the real thing. The model represents a phenomena and is a tool to predict or explain this world. They mention that models can take many forms. They can be diagrams, 3D objects, mathematical representations, analogies, or computer simulations. You'll notice that this is a concise definition of this practice, but it contains many of the same things that we just noticed from our readings. The bullet points in the center column show you what students do. They may create or use a model to explain or predict scientific phenomena, processes, or relationships, and they would be evaluating the merits and limitations of a model. An example is given, and in this case, it's a middle school example of how students might develop and use a model during an instructional sequence. So we're looking at LS3-1. This is currently in 8th grade PE in Kentucky. Develop and use a model to describe why structural changes to genes, mutations, located on chromosomes may affect proteins and may result in harmful, beneficial, or neutral effects to the structure and function of an organism. They cite an example of class activity helping students as they work towards understanding that might have them creating a model of a strand of DNA. They then alter the base pairs, the letters, to simulate a mutation. Students use their model to explain how changes in base pairs lead to changes in the proteins constructed. And here's the 4-level continuum for developing and using models. The continuum document is in your resources below, titled ILSP Practices Continuum. This continuum is a reflective tool developed for teachers of grades K-8 to help them take the essence of the practice and scaffold how the practice develops incrementally. You'll notice a pattern. Lots of things we discussed as essential parts of this practice, like using models to predict or explain phenomena and thinking about merits and limitations, are included in this continuum. As we noted earlier, developing student abilities in the use of a practice is a process that happens over time and with multiple experiences. This continuum can be applied in the K2, 3-5, or 6-8 grade bands. So please take a few minutes to pause the video and look at this continuum on the screen or in your copy. Notice the differences that you see in the increasing complexity of this practice. What are those key changes and differences that you see between levels? Consider highlighting those things that really ramp up the sophistication of the practice. Please discuss this with your PLC if you're working with a team, and then restart the video and we'll talk through those key levers together. We see at level 1, the teacher doesn't provide opportunities for students to create or use models. At level 2, the teacher is providing opportunities for students to create or use models, but the models are focusing on describing natural phenomena rather than predicting or explaining the natural world. Students aren't evaluating the merits and limitations of a model. Then at level 3, the teacher is providing opportunities for students to create or use models focused on predicting and explaining the natural world, but students are not yet evaluating the merits and limitations of models. At level 4, there are opportunities for students to create or use models focused on predicting and explaining the natural world, and those opportunities do include evaluating the merits and limitations of models. So in level 2, the opportunities to create or use models are there, but only descriptive models are the focus. Level 3, they're using models to predict or explain, but not yet evaluating them. And then in level 4, students use models focused on predicting and explaining, as well as evaluating the merits and limitations. Can you see the incremental progression here? This is a process that really needs to be developed over time with intentionality. And now for my favorite part, lesson examples. We're going to see how beefing up the use of the practice can be done in a lesson. We're going to look at a sample lesson played out at 4 levels of complexity in vignettes that are labeled A, B, C, and D. In your resources, please find the lesson adaptation for developing and using models. In this lesson adaptation series, Mrs. Mitchell's 2nd grade class is in the middle of a unit on ecosystem interactions. In this particular lesson, students are developing a model to reflect the role of animals in plant reproduction, for example, dispersing seeds or pollinating plants. Students spent previous sessions researching and watching video clips to investigate the roles of animals as they were involved in seed dispersal and plant pollination. Here's the performance expectation that this lesson is addressing. 2 LS2-2. Develop a simple model that mimics the function of an animal in dispersing seeds or pollinating plants. So here's the task that you're going to do. Please read through the versions of this lesson, A, B, C, and D. Then look at that continuum for modeling and match the vignettes to the description of the use of the practice. So in one vignette, the teacher will not provide the opportunity for students to create and use models at all. That lesson will be your level 1 lesson, and so forth. So you're looking for evidence in the vignette that supports the continuum level 1 through 4. Pause the video now while you read and rank the lesson adaptations. Some thought questions are here on the screen to guide discussion with your group if you're working as a team. Restart the video when you're ready to talk through the vignette order with me. This could be a longer working break or perhaps even a second PLC. So you're going to be thinking about where did you place each lesson on the continuum and what evidence did you find in each vignette to match those key levers. And you're going to be thinking about your own classroom instruction. What are your next steps in bumping up the complexity in student use of the practice? Let's talk through these together. The vignette that matches the level 1 description is lesson adaptation A. Students watched a video and they read informational text out loud. But Mrs. Mitchell is the one to share which bits of the reading were important information in each section, and she takes the notes on the board. Then she asks students to copy a diagram from their book. The students didn't create or use a model themselves. They just replicated a diagram from their book. The lesson that matches level 2 is lesson adaptation D. Students did create a model of a hummingbird and a flower that is descriptive, but it doesn't explain or predict how that animal is involved in pollination. The level 3 lesson is lesson adaptation B. Students created models and used them to predict what type of animal would be attracted to what type of flower or seed. They did not evaluate the models in this lesson scenario, however. And in vignette C, we see the most sophisticated use of the practice by students because their teachers set up the experience to allow them to create and use models to make predictions and to evaluate the models as they did a gallery walk, suggesting strengths of the models and offering their ideas on things that could be changed. Let's think for a minute about what we see here in the way these 4 lessons were presented. Did it take any more money or supplies for Ms. Mitchell to support students in a level 3 or level 4 use of this practice? It did not. I really like the way you can see how even young students can create and use models at sophisticated levels of complexity. Undoubtedly, this was not the first experience with these second graders using models. However, one thing we really like about the continuum is that you can see how to make incremental changes in the use of the practice. You can start by giving students the opportunity to create and use models, and then guide them to use those models to predict or explain. After some guided experiences developing and using models to help predict or explain about a phenomenon, students will be ready to evaluate strengths and limitations of models. On the Instructional Leadership in the Science Practices website, you can find a lesson adaptation for each of the 8 practices. These practical examples can really help you visualize the continuum and look at your next steps. Now that we've looked at some examples of lessons with modeling at different levels of sophistication, we're going to take a look at what the standards tell us about this practice to answer the question, how does student use of this practice increase in complexity throughout the grade bands? In the resources linked below, please find a document titled Appendix F, the NSTA matrix of the practices. This version is a colorful matrix from Appendix F that is made by NSTA. NSTA provides lots of standards-based resources that are free to members and non-members alike. You'll want to open that document and scroll through it to the second page on developing and using models. Let's take a minute to look at how this page is set up. At the top, there's some general information about the practice, and the body of the table contains 4 columns. A general description of the practice is given at each grade band, and then below that are bullet points giving you specific elements of the practice for that grade band. These are the behaviors that we want to see students engaging in during classroom lessons to develop their abilities with the practice at their age. At this point, I want to clarify that the elements of the practice listed in the columns under that grade band are not grade level specific. They're what we want students to be able to do by the end of that grade band. So by the end of second grade, the end of fifth grade, eighth grade, and 12th grade. So if you're teaching sixth grade, which is not at the end of the grade band, you may need to scaffold that element of the practice as your students incrementally work towards that. Now, please pause the video and take a few minutes to read and highlight some things you notice about this practice. You may want to take some notes as you work. I'd suggest that you might want to start and read down through the grade band columns first, perhaps beginning with the one you teach. What are the elements of the practice in K2, 3-5, 6-8, and 9-12? And then next, take a look at the elements of the practice and follow them across the page from left to right. How does that practice become more complex at higher grade levels? Take a look at the patterns you see. Does that raise any questions for you? What does this mean for your school and your students? So pause the video now while you read and work. I want to share a few of my takeaways as I look at the progression of this practice. I'm going to start looking at the K2 grade band. In K2, we want to help students distinguish between a model and the actual thing it's representing. So how are they the same? How are they different? And we want them to recognize common features and differences as they compare models. They'll begin to develop and or use models to represent amounts, relationships, and relative scales within things in the natural world. Near the bottom of the K2 column, we see a specific engineering application. We want students to develop a model based on evidence to represent a proposed tool or object. Now I'm moving to the 3-5 grade band. Here we see that students are building on what they've done in K2, and we see that students are now also identifying limitations of models. They're collaboratively, either in small groups or with the teacher, developing and or revising a model based on evidence that shows relationships. We want them to have experience developing a model using an analogy, example, or abstract representation, and to describe and predict about phenomena. And again, at the bottom of the 3-5 column, we see additional engineering applications of modeling. Students will be developing diagrams and prototypes to convey that an object, tool, or process can meet an engineering design solution. They'll be using the model to test cause and effect relationships or interactions within a system. Then in 6-8, we see more evaluation of the limitations of the model in that top box. Students will develop or modify models to show what happens if a variable's changed. They'll begin using models to help explain relationships among variables, which can help them predict observable phenomena. They use models to predict or describe observable phenomena and unobservable mechanisms. We definitely see a move to thinking about things at different scales or things that are not readily visible within this grade band. And then by 9-12, students evaluate merits and limitations of two different models to select or revise to best fit design criteria. The idea of looking at a model to see how reliably it functions shows up in 9-12. They'll be testing that model for reliability. Students are using models for more complex thinking about the relationships between systems or between components of the system. Also at 912, we see that we want students to have the ability to use different types of models and be able to move back and forth between models based on merits and limitations of those models. In 912, students develop complex models that allow for manipulation and testing of a process or system. They develop and/or use models, including mathematical and computational, to generate data to support explanations, predict about phenomena, analyze systems, or solve problems. So you can see how these skills really build on the previous grade band. I think a look at the vertical progression of this practice really emphasizes the importance of science education in earlier grade bands and how that supports more complex use of models in later grades. This progression can also help me see whether or not I'm using grade band appropriate levels of scientific modeling. And if I feel like my students aren't quite ready for that yet, I can look back at the previous grade band to see what missing skills I may need to address. So take a moment now to pause and reflect. How can this progression of the practice be helpful to you in planning? And how can it help inform what you're doing in your classroom with instruction and with assessment? Jot down your ideas individually and then take a few moments to share your ideas with the group. In our work with teachers around our state, we find that a lot of teachers find this document really useful to help them define what exactly the practice of developing and using models includes, and it helps them plan for experiences within lessons that can build student abilities. It can be used to reflect on a lesson and think, was what I did building toward grade band appropriate use of this practice? It can also help define performance tasks that you may want to do with your students. Now we're ready to take a look at some strategies that can be used to help students develop their abilities in scientific modeling. In this section, we'll be using more resources from the NSF-funded project on the Instructional Leadership in the Science Practices website. I'd encourage you after this video to really check out the different video examples, lesson transcripts, and lesson adaptations that are available here to help you visualize how to make the practices come to life for your students. Just like there's a lesson adaptation series for each practice, the ILSP website also has a list of instructional strategies for each practice. Once you're on the website, click the Tools tab, and then select Tools for Instruction. The downloadable list of strategies for developing and using models is in the resources for this video. The instructional strategies list provides examples of strategies you can use to support this science practice. These are strategies that can be embedded in lesson plans to help students build their abilities. These lists are really just a start, but we've found them to be very helpful in stimulating discussion of different techniques that can help embed scientific modeling into lessons. Please take this opportunity to pause the video and read through these strategies, discussing possible applications with your teammates, and be sure to add your own ideas to the list. I've used several of these and felt like they were really helpful with making student thinking visible, but I wanted to call your attention to a few. I particularly like number 2, where students critique and compare a scientific model and a non-example. That's a great way to help them understand what a scientific model needs, what it needs to be, and how it is more than just a labeled diagram or just a description of something. With a side-by-side comparison, it's easy to see differences. Number 5, that 5th strategy on the list, also is a great one, I think, because it does a nice job of providing for student choice with the type of model that they get to create. And strategy 8 also really lends itself to choice of model and to revision to reflect new information. So try a few of these out with your class. Another strategy that we'd like to share comes from BSCS Science Learning. This is called the analogy map strategy, and this strategy is in your resources. Analogy maps can be used to help students make sense of how a model that they're using relates to the concept that they're studying. Analogy maps can be used with a variety of types of models, even mental models that students are thinking about. You want students to be clear on what the different parts of the model represent, so they can use the model to explain or predict what might happen when they're presented with a phenomenon. You also want them to recognize the merits, how the model is like the real thing, and possibly think about some limitations. An analogy map helps students look at the components or parts of the model and think about what that part of the model is like in the real world. Students think of ways the model is like the real thing, which would be a strength of the model. And you may also choose to add a column to show how that part of the model is not like the real thing, to help them think about the limitations of the model. Take a few moments and look through this example and discuss with your group, how could this help your students see the merits and limitations of models and make more sense of what they're doing so they can use that model as a predictive tool? First, we're going to choose a phenomenon. How do plants end up in places that we didn't plant them? Or how can a seed move to new places? Because this type of scientific modeling and how it could be embedded in a storyline may be new to you, I'm going to take a few minutes to walk through a sample lesson sequence so you can see how models can be developed, revised, refined, and used to explain or predict. We'll stick with the idea of seed dispersal for this sequence and visualize the progression of learning. First, we'll choose a phenomenon. How do plants end up in places where we didn't plant them? Or that could be reworded, how can a seed move to new places? So what do we want students to figure out about seed dispersal and about how animals might be involved? We hope that they'll learn that seeds can be moved around in several different ways. They can be moved by interactions with animals, like through animal droppings, catching on fur or clothing. They can also be blown by the wind to new places. They may float on water and disperse. And we want them to recognize that animals have structures that can help move seeds to new places, as well as seeds have structures that help determine how they're dispersed and how they survive. Students come to the table with lots of rich experiences and ideas. And as a teacher, we want to mine that thinking and build on that. A big part of helping students learn is to uncover that thinking so we can plan learning experiences to maximize class time as we move student thinking forward. With our phenomena in mind, I'd like to start by having students work to draw their initial model, showing their thinking about our focus question. How do seeds end up growing in places where we didn't plant them? So they might first draw initial models to show their seed dispersal ideas. And as they're working, they might be engaging in the practice of developing and using models. The cross-cutting concepts of cause and effect, structure, function, and system models might begin to surface in their sense making. And then next, I would let students share their models, describe their understanding, and add new ideas to their models from the discussion that has occurred in partners, small groups, or the whole class setting. So they'd be obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information then. After sharing ideas, students would have the opportunity to ask questions and then plan and conduct an investigation to see how seeds move. I'd provide students with various types of seeds, burrs, acorns, redbud seeds, strawberry seeds, just whatever you have that you can find at hand of different types of seeds, a woolly sock, a cup of water, some fake fur or Velcro, a straw to blow air through, and so forth. Then we collaboratively plan investigations to answer some of their testable questions. We'd collect data about how seeds move in notebooks and analyze that data to construct an explanation or an evidence-based account. So this would help engage students in asking questions, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing data, and eventually perhaps constructing an explanation. While the cross-cutting concepts of patterns, cause and effect, and structure and function would help students as they looked at their results and data. Students can add new ideas to their models from the data they collected in the experiments. Here you see this student has revised and added the idea about some seeds floating, which he learned from experimentation. Next, students will be ready to read for information and collect and analyze data from text. In this process, they'll be able to build their skills in obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information, analyzing data, and using mathematics and computational thinking. The cross-cutting concepts of patterns and cause and effect would be used too. You see in this experience that students are collecting information from text and media and organizing that data in a chart to see patterns and relationships. Now, armed with lots of new information, they're ready to return to their models and revise again. Their models will help them predict or explain how a seed could end up in a place that wasn't planted by humans. As a teacher, we'd be talking at this point about the elements we'd want to see in a good model and starting to reach consensus about what should be included. At this point, we'd be comparing their models to see common features and differences. And last, students could use their model and the new ideas that they've learned to help develop explanations or evidence-based accounts, as they're called in primary grades, for this phenomenon. The teacher might provide sentence frames to assist students who benefit from that, or orally discuss the models with students as they're assessing their understanding to see if they can use their model to explain or predict how seeds might have moved. To summarize the sequence, students were first introduced to the phenomena and they drew initial models to show their thinking. Then they shared their ideas with classmates, learning from each other, and they were given a chance to revise their models. Students asked questions and developed investigations to learn more about how seeds move and how animals are involved in the process. After sharing their findings from investigation, the students get the opportunity to revise their models again to reflect their learning. Students used informational text, including books and media, to collect new data about seed dispersal. The final revision of their models then takes place with the class comparing models to identify common features and differences and agreeing on some common elements that need to be included in the model and why. This is the kindergarten through second grade beginning stage of looking at merits and limitations of models. Students use their models to write explanations for the phenomena. So I hope that seeing how this modeling sequence could have played out in a classroom has been helpful to you as you plan for improving the practice of scientific modeling with your own group. And note that many of the practices and cross-cutting concepts were really intertwined in the learning and the sense-making that took place here. Our goals for today's session were to develop an understanding of what's meant by a scientific model, to develop a deeper understanding of the science and engineering practice, developing and using models, to explore what's meant by developing and using models for each grade band, and to increase our knowledge of instructional strategies that can help students develop skill in developing and using models. As a closing reflection with your PLC group, please consider the following two questions. What are the benefits of scientific modeling, and how does it relate to student learning? And why is modeling important as students figure out new science ideas? So if you'd pause now and discuss those with a partner or a small group. Here's a few of my takeaways. Modeling makes student thinking visible, and that helps teachers as they listen for incomplete science ideas. That helps them be able to plan for upcoming instructional experiences. Students are going to see their own thinking change and progress over time, and note that it's becoming more scientifically accurate. Students will have the opportunity to reconsider ideas in light of new evidence. And that process of scientific modeling can help students see learning as a journey and not a destination. Thanks so much for watching. As we close, please take a minute to reflect. What are your personal strengths in approaching this practice? And what are your challenges? What opportunities can you find in your current classroom instruction to incrementally increase student abilities in the use of this practice? And which of the resources that are shared will you use to accomplish these goals? We've got that modeling chapter. You can go back and dig into that blue NSTA matrix of Appendix F, the instructional strategies and the ILSP continuum. Lots of resources there that we hope will be really helpful to you as you move forward. So please check out the other videos that we have available on the science and engineering practices on our website. And there's also another video on modeling with an emphasis on mathematical and computer-based modeling that might be of particular interest to you after completing this module.